Great. Well, we're recording this event, so just so other people know, for posterity, and thank you so much for joining. Marissa, do you want to provide the introduction to our meeting today?
Yeah, just so everybody knows, I'm dropping a link to a Miro board periodically, so check in the chat and you'll be welcome to join onto that Miro board. I'll get us kicked off. Whoop, that's the wrong way for that screen. Too many Zoom screens. Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to this panel. I want to begin by acknowledging that we live and work on the ancestral and unceded territory of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we call home, and I'd encourage you to reflect on the specific peoples and treaties which govern the land you live in. For example, I'm coming from Kitchener, which is on the Haldimand Tract that protects 6 miles on either side of the Grand River for Haudenosaunee peoples from 6 nations of the Grand River. This land is additionally governed by two-row and dish-with-one-spoon wampums. In reflecting on our relationships with the land, we reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. I'd like to just take a small moment of reflection to think about how we are and can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thanks everyone. Okay, so in just a minute, we will go ahead and get things started. I'll have each of our panelists quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll start on our discussion. Panelists are reminded, I've told them a million times because I'm that kind of moderator, that we'll have to keep our intros pretty short to maybe 2 to 3 minutes in length, because there's quite a few of us. I want to note that we are missing, unfortunately, one of our panelists today. Megan Webb wasn't able to join us. She's had a family emergency, so we wish her the best of luck. Hopefully everything turns out okay on her end. And I'll just let Chris give you a quick talk here about the National Trust Conference, which is hosting this chat today.
Thanks so much, Marissa. Yes, coming to you, it's Chris Weed from the National Trust here in Ottawa, and coming to you from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, and we're of course grateful to be living in this beautiful place. Wanting to just launch this webinar, Succession Planning for the Heritage Sector, the Labor Market and Emerging Professionals. Wanted to launch this today with this really great group of panelists. It's a part of it's kind of a lead up to this National Trust Conference that we're holding with the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals and the Indigenous Heritage Circle that's happening in Ottawa at the end of October, called Transforming Heritage. And really wanted to have this webinar and this discussion with this group of emerging professionals and people in this part of the sector before the conference, to really get a sense, take a pulse for where things are at in Canada, and think about some of the issues. And I want to work with the group to get some of these ideas that are generated today up in front of the rest of the conference delegates during the conference, and feed into discussions there. There's going to be a report back from this session today at the conference in one of the sessions, but wanting to really get some of those materials out there in other ways as well. So this will be very helpful. And I think it's an exciting time, just really quickly about the conference. It's an exciting time for the heritage conservation movement, because we all know that, that Canada's heritage conservation movement is really transforming itself to meet new needs in society. It needs to do much more. It needs to advance things like decolonization and anti-racism. It needs to be a real leader in climate action. And it needs to address socioeconomic challenges that are front and center in our communities, and needs to show its relevance. So now at this point, this juncture, the heritage sector really has the opportunity to accelerate and to explain the benefit we have for society, and to be part of really make transformational changes in our mission and practice. So excited to think about how the emerging professional sector and succession planning can figure in some of those discussions that we have at the conference and beyond in the transforming sector that we are a part of right now. So I'll pass it back to Marissa to launch us off. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. So I'll formally introduce myself now. My name is Marissa Barris, and I am ICOMOS Canada's current executive director. And in addition to having an MSc in archaeology, I'm also working part-time towards an MA in planning. Like many other emerging professionals, I come from a fairly privileged background that allows me to tolerate low wages and poor quality contracts throughout my undergraduate and gave me a clear advantage in being able to accept poor quality but topically relevant work where others could not. Despite this, I found myself gaining work in roles which reflected my skills and experience, but which continued to pay maybe $1 or $2 above minimum wage throughout my early 20s. It's because of experiences like this that we're having this discussion today. This session is the result of a few different things. First, it's a response to employment prospects in the heritage sector. Low wages, short-term contracts, high education expectations, high degrees of competition for quality jobs, and poor cross-disciplinary communication, which make it difficult to find stable careers. Second, this session is also a response to the absence of emerging professionals and youth in spaces where issues of education and employment are addressed. The heritage sector has a huge number of very capable people who are extremely concerned with the future of this sector, but these people rarely seek out the opinions of those who are part of the next generation in their discussions. The goal of this session is therefore to spark some meaningful conversation of the realities of those entering the labor market to help identify the barriers that we should be working to address. We have a mural board available for you that you can drop some of your thoughts and feelings and questions in throughout the discussion. We also are going to be taking questions in through Zoom throughout, so feel free to chime in at any point in time if you have anything in particular that you want to ask our panelists. The results of the panel, like Chris said, will be presented at the National Trust Conference next month. We'll have a short 7-minute presentation where we'll summarize kind of some of the conversation that we've had here and identified some potential ways to move forward. So because I'm already speaking, I'm going to kick us off with a short introduction to youth and heritage before I pass it on to some of our other panelists here. So here we are. So Youth and Heritage is kind of the project that I'm here to speak about. It's run by ICOMOS Canada and funded by Parks Canada through an agreement through the Youth Employment Skills Strategy. And basically, its primary purpose right now is to provide a wage subsidy for youth who are working in heritage. So up to $3,200 or 50% of the youth's contract. I want to share just really quickly some key data. So data so far from, we're in our second iteration of the program. Our first iteration was 2021, 2022, and now we're doing 2023, 2024. So we have incomplete data for our current cycle, but I've kind of compiled everything as best I could. Some interesting statistics is that the youth who we've been able to support, 59% of them come from underrepresented communities. 42% of them are visible minorities and or Indigenous. And we only have this data for this current cycle, but 85% of the youth who we've been able to support this cycle identifies to us LGBTQIA+. So that's, I think, a pretty interesting statistic. Some really high-level wage data. We don't have this level of data for 2021, 2022, but the average wage of applications for our subsidy is $20.20 an hour. The average living wage salary in 2022 is $21 an hour, and the average age of employees applied for was 23.7. So that's kind of also a couple of interesting statistics. Some employment areas from 2021, 2022, we don't have the resolution to be able to talk about 23, 24 yet, but lots of people in planning, lots of jobs in management, which I think is kind of interesting. Also some work in research, and then a few jobs in trades, a couple of interns. We also funded a lot of archival work, which is interesting. And then these were the key job skills that people have pointed out to us so far in terms of what they're looking for in youth who are applying for work. So people are really looking for youth that have good communication skills, team skills, that have data management experience. Research and report writing is very important. Project management also really comes out as a big highlight. So those are kind of some interesting skills that people are expecting youth to come into the labor force with, and maybe we can have some productive discussion on whether or not those skills are coming out in education. So that's me, and I'll pass it on to, I guess we'll start with Sarah because you're in my top left corner.
Okay, thank you, Marissa, for that data, and I hope we talk about those some more in the discussion. So my name is Sara Shemirani. I have a Bachelor of Architectural Science from Toronto Metropolitan University, and for the past 3.5, almost 4 years, I've been working at JIMO. JIMO is an architecture firm integrating design and heritage conservation. So what would I do in my day-to-day? It's anything from condition assessments to conservation plans and heritage interpretation installations. I also volunteer at ACO NextGen. So ACO is the Architectural Conservancy Ontario, and the NextGen is a group of emerging professionals who have worked together since 2011 to bring events and programs throughout the year for fellow emerging professionals and students. And we hold 2 annual programs, the Job Shadow and the Design Shred. And how did I get into the heritage sector? I always knew that I'm interested in heritage conservation from the aspect of cultural preservation and sustainability. But in my education, it wasn't until the 4th year that I had the option to really take a course about heritage conservation and theory. And even after that, I wasn't quite sure how I would fit in the sector per se. And when I attended the ACO NextGen Job Shadow program, my placement actually taught me a lot about what goes on in the sector if you come into it from the architecture perspective. What is a heritage consultant? What is a heritage architect? What can you potentially do? So that program was very valuable to me launching my career. I will pass it on to the next person, Marissa.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Okay, we'll go down to Leanna.
Hello, my name is Leanna Wigboldis. I am a Canadian emerging professional, obviously. And I'll start off kind of with how I got into heritage. I'll just give you a very brief overview. I originally wanted to do art restoration, and I was like, this is what I want. And then I took my first chemistry course in university and went, this is not what I want. And so I shifted into heritage, which was actually really lucky for me. As Marissa mentioned, I've been very lucky to have numerous opportunities to go abroad and work with heritage because, again, as Sarah also mentioned, it's kind of hard to find an education area for Canadian students who want to go into heritage. Hopefully this is changing, but when I first started looking into it, it sort of wasn't as much of an option. And so basically I went to Dublin. I did a bunch of international workshops in Sweden, in Ireland, in France. I was lucky enough to become an intern at ICOMOS Secretariat, the International Secretariat in Paris for a year, which was amazing. And I worked with the Connecting Practice Project, which brings together culture and nature to better collaborate and integrate these ideas, not just at a site level, but also at an institutional level. And so that really sparked my interest in World Heritage. So I did an MSc in World Heritage at University College Dublin. Currently, I'm completing my PhD in World Heritage as well, where my focus is on traditional knowledges and biocultural practices for landscape continuity, resilience, and sustainability. So this kind of broadened into climate change interest. It broadened into food security, a lot of really sort of tangible results that are going to be affecting our world in the future and are currently affecting our world. So that's kind of where my approach for heritage came from. Similarly to what everyone's saying, finding a job in heritage is difficult. I'm lucky enough to work on contract with EVOC Strategies, which is our office is based in Ottawa, but it's an affiliate of EVOC Architecture, which is in Montreal mainly. And so I get to work with heritage on a daily basis, which is pretty much the dream. But that's a little brief overview of me. So Marissa, back to you.
Thanks, Leanna. And then I see Natalie next.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here and thank you for joining. My name is Natalie Maida. I am currently a Master's of Arts student studying planning at the University of Waterloo, but I have a background in history and ethics, society, and law at the University of Toronto. Found my way into heritage planning through an unclear and a bit of ambiguous path through my interest in social history and preserving and communicating that history to generations ahead of us. And one of the questions I wanted to reflect on in my introduction was, did my education prepare me for the job market? I would say it sort of did. It had to be a patchwork of educations to prepare me for the job market. My formal education through my bachelor's and now my master's prepared me with some of the core skills I need in heritage planning, like research and writing and legislative interpretation. But I was missing a lot of the unspoken requirements, such as how to find the job market, how to navigate it through emerging opportunities like Young Canada Works, and that required a lot of coffee chats with a lot of professionals to have a sense of how this operates. And then self-directed learning through exploring what legislation I needed to know and then learning it and more of that. So my formal education wasn't enough, but through a patchwork of self-directed work, I found my way. And yeah, I'm very excited to be on this chat and discuss some of the barriers that I've experienced and have heard from people through my extracurricular involvement in helping youth in heritage.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And then next I see Solène.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Coming from Edmonton here. I'm Solène Malé-Gauthier. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Alberta. Before coming to the PhD program, I completed a master's and an undergrad degree in archaeology at Université Laval in Quebec City. I guess you could say my job is being a PhD student. I'm lucky enough to receive funding to do my research and live fairly well. And it's also really a full-time commitment. I would say that my training in archaeology, specifically at the master's level, was very helpful to prepare myself to the job market, the archaeology, I guess, job market. A lot of teamwork, project management, report writing and research kind of all combined together. The undergrad degree to a certain extent, you know, teamwork again, field work, experience, all that sort of stuff. But I think my skills, the skills that could be applied to the job market were really refined throughout my master's degree. In terms of barriers that I have myself personally encountered or that I've heard about through from peers or colleagues, I list 4 here. First of all, I think it's something that cuts across, you know, any heritage leaning job is often the contractual or temporary nature of a lot of archaeological work. Does tend to turn away some people that could do the work, but cannot afford to do to work in these conditions, unstable conditions, I guess. Again, the often informal hiring process that I think Natalie kind of referred to as well tends to disadvantage some people and advantage others. In terms of disadvantage folks, we're thinking a lot of queer people of color or disabled people specifically. And related to that, there's a perception that archaeological work is very field work based, and not a lot of people, I'm generalizing here naturally, but not everyone is willing to make space or to hire people to do other types of archaeology related work, like a lot of lab work or analysis, data processing, etc., which is very important and in fact essential in archaeology, and is often work that will be done by people that can't necessarily go into work, like disabled folks, or a lot of women also work in a lab-based context. So there's this kind of Indiana Jones symptom, I guess, that we perceive archaeology as this like very masculine, action, risk-taking kind of based thing that will turn away some people from the work. Yeah, so that's all I have for my intro.
Thanks, Hélène. My background's in archaeology too, so I have some thoughts and feelings as well, especially relating to field schools and expectations for people to pay to conduct labor, and how that's a huge barrier for people who can't pay to fuel your projects. So Antonia, you're last to go.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Antonia Krajina. I started my career in nonprofit education in Croatia, where I graduated as a teacher of art history and Croatian language and literature. I moved to Toronto in 2012, and I worked in nonprofit and community work before going to United States to get my master's in museum studies, where I focused on museum education and wrote my master's thesis on co-creation in museum programming. I returned to Toronto in 2016, and I worked and volunteered in the museum sector until the pandemic, basically. I'm currently working in the learning and development field in the public sector, and I am in the process of getting my certificate in adult education. And I'm also a co-founder of Museum Labor, which is a resource for emerging professionals in the museum, arts, culture, and heritage sectors. And interestingly enough, I did actually find my museum studies degree to be really beneficial to my work in museum sector. I think it really gave me a great overview of the theoretical museological issues. It sort of put me in touch with, or sort of connected me with, major organizations and associations, and really gave me a practical insight into the work of various museum professions. However, I did have that sort of switch and difference between sort of doing my degree in the States and sort of understanding the museum field in the States versus how things work in the museum sector in Canada. And I think, talking about barriers that we experience, I think as an immigrant who had, international experience, 2 foreign degrees, I definitely struggled at the beginning with translating that into a recognizable value. Especially while I was still on a temporary work permit, so before getting my permanent residence status. And then I also really entered the field as a mature student. This was really, museum studies was my second degree. It was my second career. So even before starting my master's program, I aged out of the programs that are usually employment programs that are usually geared towards emerging professionals, which are interestingly often equated to young professionals. And then also in the last few years as a parent and an emerging professional at the same time, I think some of the barriers that I've experienced was, as a museum educator, oftentimes you would be required to work evening or weekend work, or just having like irregular shifts that, are oriented towards around museum events. And then obviously, right, positions that are often not being paid a livable wage, especially not a livable wage for someone who has a family or whoever to support. And I think these barriers in particular were one of the reasons why I was inspired to co-found Museum Labor, because I definitely found that there's a lack of labor resources for emerging professionals, so that we can provide some programs and resources both for emerging professionals, but also for employers. And then also conduct research and really better understand issues and barriers affecting emerging workers. And last year, we launched a survey to look into emerging professionals' experiences with the Young Canada Works program, which was obviously one of the most frequently used sort of experiences to gain these sort of early steps in our sectors. And you know, when we sort of look through our results, definitely one of the most frequently expressed barriers we heard about was definitely age. And then lack of permanent full-time opportunities that I think several people mentioned already, and also a living wage, a wage that sort of it can be used really to support yourself and or your family in your place of residence.
Thanks, Antonia. Yeah, I think that that's a really good point talking about, well, I think wages are a major issue, especially with the like wild rise in cost of living recently. It's just completely impossible to work for some of the wages that people think are appropriate. I think that there's sometimes a little bit of people who are no longer competing for, you know, $17 an hour for a job that requires a master's degree at a minimum. People think $17 an hour, well, that's pretty good wage. But then when you actually look at it, it's, you know, $1.50 above minimum wage, and you need a master's degree. It's kind of like the expectations are quite high, especially when, as I showed, the average livable wage across the country is $21 an hour. That's average. That's not, you know, where most people will be living in big cities. It's higher. So that's some great points. I just want to really quickly pop up the mural board on my screen so that everybody can just kind of get a glimpse of what's going on over there. We've got a couple of comments already based on the conversation we've been having. So working in heritage means a lot of different jobs. Absolutely. We specifically tried to collect a range of people here today that have backgrounds in a variety of things. So we've got museums, planning, architecture, conservation, archaeology, which is, I think, going to really enrich our conversation. Some other comments on aging out and barriers there. That's really great. And then contract-based employment, I put that in after some of the conversation that we had here. So I'll really encourage people to keep adding to the conversation here. We will be referring back to it every once in a while as the conversation continues. Right, so let's get started with some questions then. I think we've done a really good job already at kind of touching on some barriers, but I want to maybe ask about if anybody would like to maybe touch on how identities impact access to work in heritage and how that might impact barriers. I think there's like a lot of different identities. Obviously, there's a lot of intersectionality, but open to discussing about any kind of identities. I think that there's particularly something to be said about people who come from low income backgrounds and like the intersectionalities of different types of identities that tend to come from lower income backgrounds rather than others relative to the privilege that you might have. So yeah, does anybody have any thoughts?
Yeah, some immediate thoughts. Before the panel, I was talking about we had a discussion all together about what the direction of our panel today, and then after that, I was so pumped up, and I was talking to my colleagues about it and my fellow execs at ACO NextGen. So, and then one of the things that my colleague reminded me, Stephanie is in the volunteering world as well, and she's very active there. That in the heritage sector, 75% of the heritage workers are volunteers. And that's a stat from 2017 Government of Canada Survey of Heritage Institutions. So I don't know how the numbers have changed by now, but 75% is a lot, a lot of the people working in this sector. And so that automatically means that you have to have free time to be involved in this sector. And so from one aspect, oftentimes in this sector, you get your first job or your first opportunity through volunteering or networking or coffee chats, like Natalie said. So that filters out some people, so it's not very open to diversity. And in the volunteering sector, if 75% of the workers are volunteers, we experience a lot of burnout. So on the exact team for NextGen, we've come across this often. So a lot of our members, if not everyone, most of them are students, and they're already really busy, and they put in a lot of work for our events. And what we find is that quick turnarounds, because they put in so much that they get burnt out and they have to leave our team so fast. And we often find it very difficult to recruit again. And in my personal experience and the feedback we've heard from the people who have attended our events, especially the Job Shadow program, some of these placements have led to future jobs. So the thought that one day we may not be able to hold these programs, it's really scary, because that's how I got my opportunity in the sector, and that's how I know a lot of other APs and students do. So we need to change that.
Yeah, that's some great points there. A lot of the biggest kind of selling points on my CV are volunteer projects, things that I've started. It's not even paid labor. So yeah, that's a good point. I think I saw Natalie's hand flash up really quickly before Leanna's. Do you have something to say, Natalie? Or
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Sarah was saying, is that there's a privilege I have perceived you need to have to enter the heritage sector, or a certain level of privilege that certainly makes it a lot easier and a lot less of a burden. Speaking from my own experience, I pursued this as a career change from human resources into something that was a bit more fulfilling. And that required me taking a pay cut. And that required me going back to school because of a perceived requirement for a master's program. And I have been leaning on my partner to support me with that gap in the income and taking on insecure roles, contract after contract with no guarantee it'll be renewed. And that does come from a place of privilege, and I'm very cognizant of that. So I think that question of identity is definitely tied to someone's capacity to be able to lean on other resources to be able to pursue this. So yeah.
thanks, Natalie. Leanna, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, actually, it links to both Sarah and Natalie's points, so this worked well. I think that it's probably not an identity per se, but being classified as an academic, having the privilege to go to school and having the privilege to take undergrads and then masters and then PhDs, like many people don't get that opportunity. And I mean, if we're looking at the fact that you have to have a master's program, as you mentioned, Marissa, in order to get these sort of base level jobs. I mean, I went into my PhD program because I was really interested in what I was doing, and I knew that hopefully it could lead to other aspects, but like this has branched into climate change, and as I mentioned, into food security. And so it's not just about being a heritage professional, but I didn't link to anthropology or archaeology. I'm grouped under something that doesn't have a real sector. Like we call it the heritage sector, but it's sort of, you're an architect or you're an anthropologist, and we're classified under these things that don't necessarily have a space for heritage professionals to fit into all the time. So just linking to this idea of identity, so like sort of finding your identity in the location that you are. And then when I was going into my PhD, I was literally told by numerous people, you're not going to get anything out of it. But in certain situations, it's sort of like, well, if I want to get into academia or if I want to do anything kind of on an international level, a lot of people have their PhDs, and everyone said, well, you should focus on the practical work. And I went, okay, but what's the practical work for me? Like I'm gone into heritage my next practical step in my mind is working on research in heritage. But anyway, those were just a few little thoughts of sort of classification of identity, and then also just like where, like how do you get the practical experience if you have a PhD even and you can't find a job, right? So
I think that that's some really good points. There's some things there to be said about where people in different fields understand jobs to be. So there's a lot of people who are very interested in heritage who, when they're 18, go into history because they're assuming that a history degree is what will get them a job in a museum because they're 18. They don't know that there's a museum studies program. They don't know that there's an archiving program, right? They're just going, they're like, I like heritage, I'm going to go into history. And then 4 years later, you're like, oh, actually, all the jobs require an architecture degree or a planning degree. Well, I guess I have to go do that now. And if you don't have that resilience, if you don't have the support, if you don't have the privilege to be able to afford to continue those studies, because let's be honest, those funding packages don't pay. They don't pay enough, right? You're under the poverty line 99% of the time when you're in one of these programs. So a lot of people will work extra jobs and get burnt out, just like Sarah said. I'm gonna quickly highlight. There's a question in the. I'll get to you, Antonia. Sorry, but I want to highlight because I think it's a really poignant question of in the Miro board of is it easier for architecture or engineering graduates to get into better positions? And I think that there's something to be said there about expectations for what people can learn on the job and what they can't learn on the job. There's a lot of people are willing to sacrifice things like research skills, willing to sacrifice like data collection, those kinds of things. People are not quite so necessarily picky about when you're looking at hiring candidates. If you have somebody who knows how to, I don't know, use CAD, they're good at doing those kinds of drawings. But they have no archival research skills, and you've got somebody who can do archival research but has never touched CAD in their life. One of those skills people will see as teachable, and the other one maybe they won't. And I, from personal experience, know that both of those skills you can teach them to yourself on the job. So I think that that's a really interesting question that was put up there. Antonia, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's, speaking about identities and how they sort of influence our experiences in the field. I think definitely as an immigrant, that's something that really shaped my experience. And, talking about the levels of privilege and what we can afford to sort of take on, I'm just going to share that back, in 2014 or 2015, when I was looking into Master of Museum Studies programs in Canada, a year for someone with residency status, like a PR or a citizen, was I think around $11,000, and then for an international student was around $30,000 a year. So we're looking at an international student that's paying around back then around $60,000 for their degree, and not even able to pay that off for how long? Not even being able to participate in, for example, bursaries for conferences because they're reserved only for people with a residency status or people who are, like participating in Young Canada Works. So we're seeing sort of a huge influx of people who are paying large amounts of money to study, to live, and that are entering the field that's essentially almost like hostile to them. It's like not accepting. It's not permeable to immigrants. So I think for me, when we're talking about identities, that's something that definitely shaped my experience.
Thanks, Antonia. I think that that's a really interesting, like that's a really valuable perspective because there is such a high number of international students coming in. And I mean, there's also something to be said, I think, about some of the identities that are missing from our panel today. I mean, we have some differing identities. We tried to fill it in, but I think that there's something to be said about needing to hear from perspectives of people who are coming in from other places and the different barriers that you face because it's intensified, and some of the legal protections that exist for domestic students don't exist for international students. So thanks. I think we'll move on to a second question. This is a question that I was quite excited about. We had a prep meeting, and this came up, and it was a really exciting conversation. So I hope that we can maybe build on some of the comments that we had in that prep meeting. About, it's a question about passion. So I wrote, there's a general perception in heritage fields that it's a field driven by passion, and that there's an expectation for careers to be driven by interest, and how that might be a bit of a position of privilege. It's often, this idea of passion is often used to justify low wages and job insecurities, suggesting that it's somehow virtuous to sacrifice job quality because we're not in it for the money. In fact, those who leave the sector to accept jobs with stable, livable wages in fields outside of heritage can sometimes be characterized as failures because they haven't fully pursued their passions. So why do we expect heritage workers to accept poorer working conditions, to be driven by passion, and when other disciplines kind of don't have those same expectations? Like, I think it was said in our meeting before that we wouldn't expect an engineer to, take on a 3-month contract, move across the country, and be paid $15 an hour. But we definitely expect a museum worker to do that. Natalie, you can go first.
I'm just smiling at seeing how many of us put our hands up, and I'm seeing a lot of these themes being discussed on the Miro board as well. I was reflecting on this, and I think it's linked to the history of the sector as well, to the history of volunteerism in the sector, of LACACs and students walking through the streets. I come from a heritage planning perspective, so that I'm speaking from that perspective. And I think perhaps that attitude of volunteerism has perpetuated when the working realities have shifted away, and the requirements for living and being able to support oneself have made that not feasible. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the history and the present reality. And I did see one comment as well talking about on the Miro board, talking about how there continue to be volunteers that are generations ahead of us, and there's this threat of that succession planning as well. So it's important for us to address that going in, but also to consider that for people who are maturing in the profession.
Thanks, Natalie. Antonia?
Thank you. I really love, I don't want to talk about numbers and money all the time, but that's sort of like one of the things that really interests me. And when we talk, I think about, getting into the field for passion and accepting low wages, I think we also have to sort of think about like gender wage gap related to that. And I'm wondering, because we know that, for example, if you look at, Ontario Sunshine List, you can see the salaries of sort of CEOs and people who are in a higher level position. And we know from some data in the US, and I believe it also transfers over to Canada as well, that, majority of these higher level positions are occupied by people who identify as male. And I'm wondering sort of like how much of that sort of passion only low wage field is because it's mostly women occupying positions that are lower paid. So I think like it would be really interesting to look into sort of that, if there is sort of a connection between a gender and the low wage across our sectors, particularly like in specific positions. Like, for example, I know coming from, museum education sector, museum educators are historically lower paid. So I think like I think it's definitely hurtful to maintain that as a mentality. I see that every now and then showing up in like museum listservs, people who are people of position in museum sectors, leaders in museum sectors, even negating that a wage gap, gender wage gap exists in Canada. I think that's an extremely hurtful stance, because it's not really sort of allowing us to, if we're denying that a wage gap exists, we prevents us from looking into it and to address it. But I think definitely like that's an issue that's I think it's one of the biggest barriers for diversifying our sector, which is the low wage. I think that's definitely something that needs to be looked at and worked on systematically for, I think, many years to come.
Yeah. Thanks, Antonia. I think something that you said made me think as well. There's also, I think, something to be said about the type of heritage where there is work, right? Like there is tons of jobs to be a tour guide for a fancy house for some rich old white guy. And for racialized people, that can be really alienating. Like lots of people who are racialized who might be interested in heritage, is there representation for jobs for, are there jobs for racialized people to engage with their heritage? Like there's not a lot of funding for like Chinatowns and things like that. There's not a lot of funding for those kinds of places for commemorating that kind of heritage. Even all of the Black history that exists in Southern Ontario for the Underground Railroad, there's not that many museums, and the ones that do exist are not as necessarily well funded as those that are run by like bigger institutions. And what does a lack of diversity in the types of places that we commemorate and that we have funding for mean for people's ability to even pursue passions, right? Like is your passion just anybody's heritage, or is your passion your heritage? And like, are you expecting people to sacrifice their passion and their heritage for, just heritage generally that it isn't their own? I don't know, I think there's something to be said there as well. Selene.
Yes, I definitely agree with what Antonia and Natalie, have just said. I will add to that. I think, at least from my perception, there is maybe a kind of idea that the work that we do as people that work in heritage is not that useful to society. Therefore, to put it bluntly, therefore, we don't necessarily deserve the same pay as a doctor or an engineer, because how do we actually contribute to society? It might be a little intense, but it's seen kind of more as a hobby, I think, than something that actually contributes to building a society, essentially. Yeah, so I guess I'll just stay on that, because I could go on this.
Oh, that's a great point. Sarah?
I just, when we started talking about passion, it reminded me that, so like you said it, passion is oftentimes required for and is considered enough without pay to be in the sector and have a position in the sector. But how come not enough times passion can be the qualifying factor for you getting a job, and then you will be supported through training? And I've seen mentorship come up quite a few times on the Miro board, and I had highlighted that on my notes many times because other industries do it well, and so can we. So maybe you can flip the whole passion situation around, and it's what gets you a job, and then you'll be supported, you'll be trained, and you'll have mentorship.
Yeah, there's a comment from someone in the Zoom as well that says vocational awe is a huge problem and many employers take advantage of it. So I think relevant to kind of what we're talking about. Natalie?
I just wanted to say something that I've been thinking about as well, and I did see someone commented on the Miro board. So if I'm looking to the side, it's like I'm tracking the conversation that's happening off the panel as well. Maybe a union would be helpful of some sort, or perhaps I think some of the distinguishing differences between engineering and heritage is maybe the accreditation of the profession is different, and there's a bit like there's a difference there that translates down and trickles down into salary and job availability and how serious the profession is perceived, like Solène was saying. And this isn't necessarily a heritage, unique to heritage. I know planning, the OPPI and is also struggling with this like accreditation question. But yeah, so really quick note. That's what I wanted to add to this as well.
Yeah, there is actually some really interesting conversation. I mean, we weren't able to get anybody from that group for this panel, but there has been quite a bit of movement towards unionizing archaeology in Ontario. So there's quite a few firms now that are unionized, and it's I think interesting to see how the conversations have changed just over the last like 5 years. Maybe I mean the movement started before that, but it's really interesting to see how the contracts, if you just like casually are perusing job boards, how the contracts have changed. Like salary transparency is better. The like type of language and benefits that are offered are it's very different. And I think it's interesting to kind of see some evolution in what those contracts look like and how they're advertised. It's just an added point. Leanna.
Yes, thanks. Two quick points just based off of what Sarah and Solène had mentioned as well. This mentorship, I had also looked at the Miro board and saw that. And actually mentorship is one area where I have found success, but the issue is that I had to reach out to the mentors. You know, I had to be the one emailing them saying, I'm super interested in what you're doing. I want to talk more. Can I take you out for coffee? As I think Natalie had mentioned before. So, but once you get those mentors, they're super passionate about what they want to do, right? Like you get a lot of people who are really invested and really interested and who want to help emerging professionals, but just maybe don't know the avenues, right? So this is a great discussion both for passion and mentoring. And then Solène who had mentioned like, what do we actually do? I was laughing while you're saying, because it's so true. We seem to be sort of the poor cousin of archaeology and history and all that, but meanwhile, you know, we have like the World Heritage List, which is outstanding universal value for humanity as a whole. But how do we kind of translate our passion of working with this into a more holistic approach to, as Sarah had mentioned as well, into like the job stream, right? Like into these discussions, and how do we reach out? So I thought they were both really interesting points, and I just wanted to highlight it.
Thanks. I'll let Antonia go, and then before I get to you, Chris, I'm just gonna flip over to the Miro board, and then I'll split back to you because we haven't gone to the Miro board in a minute.
Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of add that I often see also passion being used as an excuse, right? To sort of not sort of take on the work that is required, right? And I think that's tied to that. Does our job even have a meaning and value, right? So why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't it have? And who defines what has value and whether our work has a meaning and for whom? So I think the passion in general, the passion argument in general is like it's so faulty and it's so hurtful in many different instances that I think it definitely needs to be abandoned as soon as possible.
Thanks. I'm just gonna flip to the Miro board really quick, and then we'll get over to Chris. But I just wanted to maybe take a look at some of these questions. So we've got here some questions about if there should be more co-ops or internships offered in graduate heritage studies. Co-op programs, I think, are not a terrible solution to getting practical work experience and actually learning the skills that employers are expecting you to learn. Unpaid, not just low wage work is very common for architectural interns too, but there's increasing discussion about it. Maybe something to learn there. Yep. Is there enough mentoring available? We had a great discussion about that. And what does languages you can work in? How does that impact employability? From personal experience, the fact that I'm bilingual, the fact that I speak French, I think like 3/4 of the jobs I've had have been because I speak French. And I think that that's kind of something that's unique to the heritage sector, is how dependent we are on bilinguality. Like if you want to get your foot in the door with Parks Canada, which is a major employer for a lot of heritage work, especially when you're, getting started, when you're a little baby, you're 19 years old looking for your summer job, Parks Canada tour guides are, that's a great way to get your foot in the door. And if you're bilingual, you got a big advantage. So I think that's a really great question. Yeah, and thanks for everybody for your participation on the Miro board. I'll flip it back over to Chris. And if if we don't get to talk about everything that's on here, we will like synthesize the Miro board and present it in October at the conference. So we will get to it. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Marissa. Yeah, no, just quick question. I guess thinking of that succession planning, just diving in here. I mean, I'm just thinking, what's the risk to the heritage sector? What's the urgency and what's the risk to the heritage sector if we don't address this? If we just sort of have a conversation and don't really look at this, the challenge of people coming into the sector. I think there's a lot of recognition that there are gaps in workplaces and what have you. I think it'd be interesting to for the panel to look at that a little bit. What is the risk for all of us to not be looking at this problem or addressing it?
Yeah. I think I'm gonna riff and then I'll pass it over to Antonia. I think that we're already seeing some of the results of the risk. I mean, if we look at in Ontario, we look at what's going on with the Science Center. That's a huge landmark. And the fact that that's at risk of being demolished, of being destroyed as a major landmark. And same with Ontario Place, what's going on over there with that kind of privatization of public space, right? Heritage is something that is public. It's not something that's private. We might see efforts towards privatizing it, and its origins, kind of legislatively, might come in from a private interest in preserving private goods. But I think that there's a general understanding among people who are in the sector that what heritage is public, what heritage is community. And if we don't have a strong heritage sector, then we risk losing access to a lot of public space, a lot of public goods. And we're already kind of seeing that. And if we have a next generation who's burnt out, who have poor quality employments, who are in school until they're 35 and aren't able to get a job they're a recent graduate at 35, so you're not expecting to pay a recent graduate more than $50,000 a year. What does that mean in terms of family planning? What does that mean in terms of being able to live your life, in terms of being able to buy a house where houses are over $1 million, just normally? What are those implications? And I think the implications are people can't sustain themselves, and what happens is there's a lack of people who are ready and able to advocate for public space and for community space. Antonia.
Thank you. I think I'm of similar opinion as well. I don't think we're getting to a bad spot. I think we are at a bad spot. I don't think that we are, as a field, doing great, and we have to be fearful of risk. I think we're, for me, coming into a field, I often didn't see myself represented, and I just mean working in Toronto, whose heritage is being reserved. So I think we're already seeing a huge loss of tangible and intangible heritage that has not been preserved because of lack of diversity in thought and in staff in our sectors. And I think if we continue down this path, that we're going to continue losing heritage. And I don't just mean myself as a Croatian woman immigrant in Canada. I just mean anyone who has felt at any point in their life disadvantaged, or has felt like they need to feel to have their uniqueness preserved. I think we've already seen, I know that in the museum sector, when it comes with how Indigenous heritage, how Indigenous culture has been handled in the museum field, there was many mistakes that were being done, and many sort of things to be corrected. And I think that generally speaking, we're at a bad spot. We need to sort of fix this. We need to look at our staff. We need to look at our practices. We need to look how to diversify our practice.
Thanks, Antonia. And then we'll let Natalie go, and then Selen, we are 1 minute over, so speed through and then we'll wrap up.
I'll speak fast. So I'm drawing on my experience speaking with youth or emerging professionals at conferences, as well as people who are more mature in the profession. I think there's a risk with knowledge transference between the emerging professionals and the people exiting the profession. There's a lot of experience there that is at risk of being lost, and that knowledge. I think we're at risk of overstretching people that are already in the profession who may not have capacity to take on the projects they want to because they don't have the extra bodies on the team to help them with that. And that impacts the type of heritage we're representing and the work that we do. And I think that there is a risk in terms of fracturing within the profession and a sense of disconnection, which I feel a lot from both from people who are established and mature in the profession and from conversations with emerging professionals. There's a sense of disconnection even within those two groups, but related to each other as well. So I think there's a risk to the form and shape of the profession. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie. And then Selene, you had your hand up.
Yeah, super quickly, really to echo what Antonia was saying, despite what people might think, our work does matter and it does contribute to society. And ultimately what we do, we contribute to building knowledge and nuancing, narratives about the past and the present, ultimately. Things about climate change, about immigrant history, about Indigenous peoples, about everything, right? So we are worried because if we can't keep doing this work, quality work, well, what we're seeing really in politics is increasingly extremist perspectives of the past that then have effects on the present. So I think that's also why it's really important to keep working in heritage and to be able to do quality work in heritage.
Thanks so much. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks everybody so much for your time and your thoughts. Thank you to everybody for participating in the mural board. We've got some really great stuff on there, and I really do hope that you all come to the National Trust Conference and come to our presentation there, where we'll be kind of showing some of a summary of our discussion and a summary of some of the things we didn't get to talk about that will be reflected on the mural board. I'm really grateful to everybody for you all to be able to have come and participate, and I look forward to hopefully working with you again in the future. And if any of you who are still here with us are interested, I'm just going to quickly plug the NextGen. If you're in Ontario, ACO NextGen is a really great resource. If you're in museums, Museum Labor is a really great resource. And for myself, ICOMOS Canada, we have an up and coming emerging professionals committee that I'm really excited. We have terms of reference, they're written, they just need to be approved. We're almost there, but we've got a really great group already of, I think almost a dozen people who are their first kind of course of action right now is they really want mentorship opportunities. So if you're seeking mentorship on a national scale, that's a great spot. Yes, Michelle, ACO NextGen, the website that you just put in there. Thanks. Great. Okay. Chris, do you have anything you want to say to sign off, or?
Well, thank you, Marissa and Liana and Sarah and Natalie and Solène and Antonia. What a stimulating and wide-ranging discussion, and really it really puts on the map the fact that transforming heritage is really, the sector really needs to be thinking of itself and thinking about how it functions, how it's bringing people in, how it's keeping people out, and thinking about the succession planning kind of whole discussion. That needs to be a part of it as well. And looking, so this conversation has really helped bring that forward, and really looking forward to talking more about it at the conference, but also beyond that. And I want to thank you all very much for being here today and helping to get the ball rolling on this important topic.
Thank you, Chris and Marissa and everyone else. Great conversation.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.